let's just say I have a bit of a problem. This video will give you a look at every locomotive that I own. Over the years, I have collected over 160 locomotives from over 30 different railroads. From one of the largest steam locomotives ever built, to one of the smallest narrow gauge locomotives. So without further ado, let's get started. Starting off with Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives, we have A3 number 96. This is a lifelike model, and at some point I would like to give this a custom paint job. Next up we have A5 number 371. This locomotive is from Bowser, and I have been steadily working on adding brass details to this locomotive. Probably one of my favorite Pennsy switchers. Now we have an unnumbered B6. This locomotive is a brass engine by Gem Olympia. Now we have one of Bachmann's classic 440s. This locomotive, however, is unoperational, and I've backdated it to resemble a D1 class. Now we have one of Bachmann's later run 440s. This one most closely resembles a D2, but I have to do some more detailing to make it closer to the prototype. Next up, we have one of the classic Pennsy D16 classes. This locomotive is 2063 and is also by Gem Olympia. This locomotive initially had quite a few problems with shorting out when I first bought it, but I was able to rectify those issues later and is not a bad runner. Now we have one of Mantua's famous 442 Atlantic types. These ones are basically meant to resemble number 7002 seen at Strasburg, but I decided to number this one as the real locomotive that 7002 is, number 8063. This locomotive was custom painted and lined by me. Not the easiest job, but it didn't turn out too bad. Moving on to one of Pensy's more modern Atlantics, we see here E6 number 461. This is a Bowser locomotive, and not a bad runner either. Now we have one of the Pensy's often overlooked Class F3 locomotives. This one is number 2063. Next up is another locomotive by Bowser, this time a Pennsy Class G5 locomotive. This locomotive has a bit of zinc rot in its cylinder casting, but it gets along alright. Up next is another brass locomotive, this time an H3 class locomotive. This locomotive is absolutely gorgeous and runs very smoothly. Its only hiccup being a very large gearbox, which means it often fouls on any switches or grade crossings. Gotta see if I can't solve that problem at some point. Up next is another one of my favorite Pennsy locomotives, this time an H6 SB number 2846. This locomotive is by Sunset Models and is a very smooth runner. Going back to Bowser locomotives, here we have an H9 locomotive number 3563. This is one of the first locomotives that I had, and needs a custom paint job at some point, we'll see. Up next we have Pennsylvania Railroad I1 class number 3687. This locomotive is also by Bowser, and a locomotive that in the last 2 years received a custom paint job. Turned out pretty good. Here we have the first locomotive in HO scale that I have ever owned. This is Pennsylvania Railroad K4 number 1361. It was given to me in a train set along with 3 passenger cars. Fortunately, this locomotive will never run again, as its pilot is broken and the wires between the engine and tender have been all pulled out on switches over the years. Going to a more reliable K4, we have another Bowser locomotive. This locomotive has been kit bashed from several other Bowser K4s to finally get a locomotive that looks decent. Oh look, another Bowser locomotive. This time it's an L1, and another one of my first freight locomotives that I've bought for the Pennsy. One last Bowser locomotive for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Here we have an M1A. This locomotive is unfortunately too big to run on my layout, but that's okay because I often run Kato track outside on my porch. Now we have one of Pennsylvania Railroad's massive J1 classes, number 6165. This locomotive is Broadway Limited and is not a bad engine. Next up is one of Pennsylvania Railroad's T1 class, number 5536. This is one of my first locomotives to have DCC and sound, and I'm quite happy with it. A lot of people don't like Broadway Limited sounds, but I think they're alright. Our last Pennsylvania Railroad steam locomotive is a Q2 class number 6195. This locomotive, when I bought it originally, came in an awful all-Tuscan red paint scheme, but I have since repainted it into a proper Brunswick green. Moving on to Pennsylvania Railroad diesels, here we have 44-tonner number 9351. Up next we have SW1 number 5987. Here we have Alco S1 9238, Baldwin S12 8774. Here's a Baldwin RS12 number 8776. Here we have GP7 7221, a lifelike product. I had to get the gears changed in this one. Runs pretty good now. Next up is a pair of RS1s, 5906 and 9914. Got these two as a pair and I opted to run them together. Next up is my favorite DCC sound diesel locomotive, RS11 8619. This has TCS wow sound and I got the best deal on this locomotive of any other engine. Only bought it for like 50 bucks. What a steal. Next up, we got a Bachmann F7, this one being 9654. Got this from my buddy Tom, who was downsizing his roster. Thanks, Tom. Now we have a trio of F7s, this being 9840, 9834, and 9835. These are Athearn models that I repainted and decaled, although I do need to redo the decaling on some of these engines as they're starting to peel off. Only one locomotive is powered though, usually have the B unit going. Next we have an A and B unit from Alco, both being 9609. These are lifelike models and they aren't too bad. I like the amount of added details to them. Now we have a pair of RF16 Sharks by ER Models, them being 9734 and 9738. Although I'd like to double head these engines, something is wrong and they do not always like to cooperate together. Gotta look into that. Here we have GP35 2261. This engine took a rough and tumble with my dog, who liked to destroy packages. Luckily the engine is fine and all the parts were able to put back together. This is my favorite class from Alco, a C425, this one being 2419. Wouldn't mind having a few more of these around actually. Pretty nice looking engine. Last for the Penzi freight engines is U2C 6500. This is a Rossi model and not the smoothest runner, kinda debating on making this a dummy unit at some point. We'll see. Moving on to Penzi passenger diesels, we have Alco PA 5750. My idea was to have at least one of every Penzi passenger locomotive in the Tuscan red livery with 5 stripes, seeing as it's my favorite. This trend continues with E9 number 5804. This locomotive, however, unfortunately took a tumble thanks to a certain farm cat, and I basically had to gut the engine and make it into a dummy unit. Thankfully, I was able to find a sister engine, also by Proto 2000, and I have that as a working unit, and it even came with DCC. So I'm able to run a pair of EMD E8s on my Penzi passenger cars. Next up we have one of the world-famous GG1s, this being 4828. This locomotive is by IHC and really isn't that good of a puller. It can barely make it around my layout, which is at a slight grade. Gotta see what's up with that. Next up is a pretty rare locomotive. This is a Baldwin BP20. This locomotive rounds out my Penzi passenger diesels pretty nicely. That is, unless you count our next engine. Here we have a Baldwin Centipede number 5833. This locomotive is so massive that I can't run it on my layout, and it barely likes to even stay on the Kato track. Kinda like the real thing. Moving on from Pennsylvania Railroad engines, we'll now go to the New York Central. Here we have the famous New York Central 999. It was made by a pewter mint. Not a working locomotive, but still a very pretty looking one. Next up we have another Atlantic from Mantua. This one is being customized to look like New York Central 967. Up next is another customized New York Central locomotive, this being a G6 number 2941. This locomotive has been kit bashed from an IHC locomotive with a Bowser K11 cab. Here we have New York Central USRA Light Pacific 1867. This locomotive is from Powerhouse, which, if you ever want to find a relatively inexpensive brass model, I can't recommend these guys enough. They're beautiful engines and they run very nicely. Now here's a classic plastic model kit of a famous New York Central J1E 5405. Following it is another J1E locomotive, also 5405, this time by Rossi. Here we have an S1A Niagara class by Broadway Limited, and after going through 2 Bachmann variants, just go with the Broadway Limited one. Save yourself a lot of time, energy, and frustration. Our last New York Central steam locomotive is L2A number 2792. This locomotive was converted from an L2B. Not my best kit bash job, but I think it definitely sells a look of the L2A. That wraps up New York Central steam. Now let's move on to diesels. Here we have an E9, this being number 4070. Next up is a pair of RF-16s, number 3810. These were some of the first brass diesel locomotives I have acquired. The same lot had another RF-16, this being by Rocco, number 3818. Here's an F7 for the New York Central, this being number 1211. Behind them we have an AB pair of F3s by Stewart. Looking to get the detail pack for these, but I can't seem to find them anywhere. They often run 1211 with the next engine, an RS11, number 800. Here we have New York Central RS1, number 8105. Certainly have a soft spot for the RS1s, and the New York Central Lightning Stripe scheme is definitely one of the better looks. 3 more locomotives came from the same lot as the Sharks, the first one being a dummy unit, GP30, number 6115, GP7, number 5628, and whatever abomination this thing is. Speaking of abominations, here's a Penn Central locomotive, an RS11 7600. Here's an Erie Lackawanna dummy unit, a GP35 number 2570. I actually bought this locomotive while I was out in Kansas City when the Model Train Expo came to town. Moving on to Conrail locomotives, we have a GP30 number 2189, and a GP35 number 2273. This locomotive was actually the second HO scale locomotive I ever owned, and I used to run this in tandem with 1361. Now we're moving on to Norfolk Southern locomotives. Here's a GP38 number 5612. This was one of my first locomotives acquired with DCC. Here's a Dash 8 number 8300. This locomotive runs pretty good, although I would like to find some handrails to replace the ones that are on the left side. Here's a Dash 8 CW by Atlas. This locomotive is DCC ready, although the chip that I bought it with doesn't seem to want to work right, so we'll have to get this rechipped at some point. Being a Pennsy fan, I naturally had to get one of the ES44ACs in the Pennsylvania Railroad Heritage paint scheme. Speaking of heritage units, here's another one, this being an SD70 ACE in the Lackawanna paint scheme. Here we have a Nickel Plate Road S1 by Hobbytown. This is a display model, but I decided to go the extra length and correct the running board length on the fireman's side. Here's another Berkshire by Rossi, this being 7079. This locomotive is not a very smooth runner, and not a great puller either. Here's a third Berkshire, this being the world-famous 765. This one's by Bachmann, and is a much better runner, but still not a fantastic puller. Had to add a lot of weight to get it to pull any decent amount of freight cars. Moving on to some Southern Pacific locomotives, here's the Daylight, number 4449. Cab forward, number 4272 by Rossi, and a pair of F7s, number 6198. And last, for the Southern Pacific locomotives, we have an Alco PA that has yet to be numbered. Moving on to Santa Fe locomotives, we have a Northern, number 3751. This locomotive is not your standard run-of-the-mill Bachmann locomotive, as it has been refitted with a Bowser chassis for smooth operation. Next up is a run-of-the-mill Bachmann, this being a 210 Ford Texas type, number 5014. Can you really call yourself a model train collector if you don't have a pair of these? These Santa Fe F7 AA sets are by Athearn and have matching coaches to go with them. Next up might be the greatest steal ever. Here's a $5 lifelike locomotive, number 3500. And guess what? It runs! Up next we have another pewter model, this being the famous Union Pacific 119 of Promontory fame. Here's another plastic kit, this being of the world-famous Union Pacific Big Boy. Wouldn't mind having a working model of one of these at some point, but good luck finding one for a decent price that actually works and is complete. Oh. Well, I did a thing. Here's my latest acquisition, a Rossi Big Boy number 4004. And one more Union Pacific, here's the famous 8444, also by Rossi. Moving on to locomotives from the Reading, here we have an I-10 number 2019. This can be compared to this brass model of a T1, which was built from the similar locomotive. I'm gonna eventually paint this locomotive up to resemble 2102, but in its Reading scheme. Rounding out the Reading Railroad, here's a pair of F7s, number 283. Moving on to one of my other favorite railroads, the Lackawanna, here we have Q4, number 1631. This was one of the first brass locomotives that I ever painted, and as nerve-wracking as it was, didn't turn out too bad. Here's another E9, number 814, and a trio of F3s, number 660, 660B, and 656. Really love that Lackawanna paint scheme on diesels. Moving on to the Erie Railroad, here we have a Russian decapod, number 2461. And the first Rossi locomotive that I ever bought, a Heavy Pacific number 2936. Here's a yet-to-be painted and numbered CNJ Camelback, and one of my favorite kit bashes of all time, a CNJ Blue Comet number 833. Moving on to Norfolk and Western steam locomotives, we have my absolute favorite locomotive of all time, 475. This locomotive is my absolute baby in my entire collection. So far, the locomotive has received a Strasbourg tender, alternative smokebox front, sunflower stack, and alternate pilot. The locomotive has also been converted to DCC and sound. Up next, we have an E2A class. This is built by Northwest Short Line. While this wasn't the locomotive that was on the actual listing, it came from Germany, so sending it back is not an option. Perhaps I can find somebody I can trade with that will give me the locomotive version that I was looking for. Here we have another famous locomotive. This is Norfolk and Western J-Class number 611 by Bachmann. Here we have a Rossi Y6B. This locomotive has been custom painted and fitted with marker lights. Rounding out the Norfolk and Western Big 3, here we have an A-Class. This one is not 1218, but its younger sister, 1217. And my last Norfolk and Western locomotive is a GP9 by Lionel. Moving on to Baltimore Ohio Railroad locomotives, here we have B&O 98, a small dockside shunter by Rossi. This thing is basically the equivalent of Hornby's Smoky Joe locomotive. Very fast and very small. Rossi must have loved their Baltimore Ohio Railroad prototypes, because here's another one, this being President Fillmore. And lastly, here's a Rossi Big 6. Much like the nickel plate Berkshires, these locomotives are not the smoothest runners, but they do look very, very good. Moving on to Baltimore Ohio diesels, here we have a pair of F3 locomotives. and another E9 locomotive. I love that Baltimore Ohio paint scheme, probably one of my second favorites compared to the Lackawanna. Here's MA and PA number 27, a very adorable looking 460. And another MA and PA locomotive, this being a Doodlebug. I got a very good deal on this locomotive, usually go for $200 a piece. Bought this one for about half that. Changing pace now, we're going to start looking at some one-offs. Here we have that classic Bachmann hump car or Gandy Dancer. Certainly a very fun novelty. Next up is a very vintage Bachmann locomotive, this being the famous John Bull of the Camden and Amboy Railroad. Then we have another Bachmann locomotive, this being the Prussian, which came in a great set with 3 little vintage cars. Here we have a classic roundhouse Shay. This one works because it has been fitted with a Northwest Shortline gear kit. Up next we have another geared locomotive, this being a 2-truck Climax by Pacific Fast Mail. Here we have another classic Bachmann offering, this one being one of the Brill trolleys. Debating whether to repaint this one. Next up we have the infamous Illinois Central number 382. This locomotive is notable for being the locomotive that Casey Jones took on his final run. Here we have one of the oldest locomotives in my collection, a Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Line number 5409. Might be looking to sell this locomotive off, as I have another Camelback that I like a little bit better. Here's another vintage locomotive, this being a classic Athearn 462 Pacific. These locomotives closely resemble a Boston, Maine locomotive, one of which is being restored at Steamtown in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I plan on repainting and decaling this locomotive to be the same one. Here's another famous Pacific, this being the Crescent Limited number 1401. Definitely one of the most beautiful locomotives River Rossi has ever produced. Next up is one of my largest operating locomotives, this being Delaware and Hudson number 1500. Here's Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, number 5623. Up next we have a pair of Amtrak Dash 8s, this being numbers 510 and 517. Definitely prefer the Phase 5 paint scheme out of both of these. Last for our one-offs, we have Strasburg 8618. Now moving on to regional railroads. Here is my take on Fallbrook Coal Company number 20, the James H. Rutter. This locomotive is the first in a whole series of Fallbrook Coal Company engines I want to do. Up next we have one of the WAG F units, this being number 2300. This locomotive is by Bowser and is one of the best looking F units I have. Next up we have 4 Tioga Central Railroad engines, starting with number 14. This locomotive was a box standard S1 from Atlas in the Lehigh Valley paint scheme. All I did was add some details and change the lettering to Tioga Central. A similar job was done with Tioga Central number 240. This locomotive being a Susquehanna painted locomotive and just has the numbers and letters switched. Number 62 was a very difficult locomotive. Most of the decals I use are from microscale, and for some reason their Lehigh Valley decals are not only difficult to put on, but they do not have enough line decals to properly finish the job. Definitely would like to take this locomotive on again at some point. Last but not least for the Tioga Central fleet is number 506. This is a CMR shell made to fit on an Atlas RS3 chassis. Certainly was not an easy job to decal, but I think it turned out alright. Although as of the making of this video, Bowser has announced that they are making their own set of RS3Ms. Probably won't pick one of those up just based on the price and the fact that I spent time making this, but we'll see. Moving a little further south, we have Lycoming Valley Railroad number 2016. This locomotive is a customized custom locomotive. Someone spent a lot of time painting this locomotive in a Reading scheme, but then when I bought it, I switched it to Lycoming Valley. And last but not least, we'll move back up to Wellsboro. Here's Wellsboro and Corning SD40-2 number 307. This is another beautiful model by Bowser. Definitely wouldn't mind having another one of these. Now we're going to look at some international models. Up first is Canadian National number 89. This is a heavily modified Bachmann 260, using parts from a scrapped Bachmann 210 and several brass castings. This locomotive is definitely worthy of a video all to its own explaining the build process. Here's another Canadian locomotive, this being a Canadian Pacific D10. Certainly one of the more classy 460s in my collection. Now to hop across the pond with some British locomotives. Up first is the famous Stephenson's Rocket. Technically I own two of these, but the first one I bought, the wires were basically scrapped. Once these wires are out, there's no going back, so if you have one of these models, take very good care of it. Here we have one of my favorite classes of British locomotives, this being the famous Great Western Railroad 14XX. However, my favorite British locomotive of all time is the IVAT Class 2 MT locomotives. This one came from Bachmann and is one of the weathered models, definitely a very good looking engine. And what railway collection would not be complete without the famous Flying Scotsman? This particular model is one of the older Hornby engines with the tender drive. I also picked out some of the details in paint, as the original model was pretty much just green, black, and red. Here's another favorite tank engine, this being one of the LBSC Terriers. Here's a Great Western Hull class. Many of you may recognize from a certain Wizarding franchise. My final British locomotive is a Princess Coronation class, City of Lancaster. Now time to move on to narrow gauge engines. Here's one of my first kit bashes ever. This was built using an old Bachmann 060 chassis and a toy that I had from growing up. My first HON30 purchase was this Plymouth locomotive. I got this when I was going to college out of state and I wanted a railroad that I could take with me. Next up we have narrow gauge locomotives number 3 and 4. Number 3 has been customized with a wooden running board and a separate number plate. These locomotives are both old mini-train models, and while they might not be the best runners, are definitely adorable. Here's number 5. This is a kit-built locomotive that fits on a Bachmann 040 chassis. Then we have number 6. This is a 244 Forney class locomotive, and at this point is the only narrow gauge locomotive where my fictional paint scheme Laurel Hill and Liberty Railroad. Last but not least, we have number 7. This is one of the newer runs of mini-train 060 Porter tanks. Definitely one of the best runners of all the fleet. Now that we've looked at some locomotives that are done, let's look at some locomotive projects I have coming up. Up first, we have one of the Buffalo and Susquehanna Atlantic locomotives. This locomotive is being built from a Mantua Atlantic with the slightly compressed Stevenson valve gear. Up next we have 3 Fallbrook Railroad locomotives. First being a 280 made from a roundhouse locomotive. The second being my take on Fallbrook Coal Company number 3, the Tioga, being built from a classic Tyco 460. Here will be one of the later Fallbrook Railroad 440s. This is one of those carry kits that made to fit on a Tyco 440. Next up we have a classic roundhouse model. This 060 tender locomotive will eventually become Baldwin Locomotive Works number 26. Next up we have a project that's almost done, this being a later built Baltimore Ohio 462 Pacific. Mantua was so close with giving this locomotive justice in model form, but if you know what you're doing, you can make this locomotive look pretty accurate. Here's another project I'm really looking forward to getting finished, this being Reading and Northern number 425. This should be another easy project, this being a movie-accurate Polar Express. Decided to go with the Bachmann Berkshire over the Lionel one because, well, have you seen the Lionel one? Molded in handrails, big light protruding out. Ugh, not for that price, no thank you. This one should be a pretty easy project too. Here we have a Western and Atlantic Railroad General locomotive. Going to paint this locomotive how it's preserved today. This next entry is another locomotive that is almost finished, this being another roundhouse 060, but this time being the saddle tank version. The only real mod I made to this locomotive was I replaced the molded-in headlight with one from a Casey Jones Rossi locomotive. Definitely gives it a really interesting and old look. This shell I want to eventually become Strasburg Railroad number 1. While the portions are pretty close, I have no idea what chassis could possibly fit in this to make it actually work. The last project locomotive I've started is going to be Everett number 11. This locomotive is built on the chassis of another Bachmann 260 and will have a roundhouse 060 shell. Now for the grand total. For steam we have 88 operational, 6 static. For diesels we have 60 working units and 12 dummies, and 3 others. This brings us to a grand total of 169 locomotives. Now we must ask, which locomotives are my favorite? Probably my top favorite locomotive is my favorite locomotive in real life, Norfolk and Western M-Class number 475. Then, Delaware Lackawanna Western number 1631, Pennsylvania Railroad 2846, Pennsylvania Railroad 8619, and the narrow gauge 40. And despite all of these locomotives, which locomotives would I want to get next? Going down this list, I would like to get a Great Western Railroad City class, preferably City of Truro, but those are pretty rare and expensive. Would also like to get a Bismarck and Lake Erie 210-4 locomotive, a Norfolk and Western 482K1, Canadian National S1 282 Mikado, a Canadian Pacific G5 462, and a Great Western Decapod so I can dress it up as Strasbourg number 90. Well folks, I hope you enjoyed looking into some of my insanity over the past couple years. Hope you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. This is K4, thanks for watching.